Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
The United States of America had its founding fathers, all land-owning white men in the 18th century who drafted its constitution. India has a different story. 15 women were members of the Constituent Assembly of India and helped shape the Constitution of India as we know it. But that only scratches the surface. Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. On this episode, Priya Ravichandran and Shruti Vishwanathan talk about the role of women in the Indian national movement, in the constitution making process, and explore the role of feminist consciousness in early 20th century India. Priya is a student and analyst of politics and policy making for the last 14 years. She has written extensively about women in the Indian Constituent Assembly in a number of publications and in her blog 15 for the Republic. Anchoring the conversation with Priya is Shruti Vishwanathan, who runs the Equals Project, which conducts workshops for children and young adults teaching constitution creation through experiential learning. In case you missed it, Shruti was in conversation on BIC Streams in June with Akash Singh Rathore on his new book, Ambedkar's Preamble. You can find the link to the discussion on the episode description on the Bangalore International Centre website or the video on BIC's YouTube channel. Shruti and Priya, thank you so much for joining us. And Shruti, over to you.
Thank you, Pawan. Today, Priya and I will be discussing the role of women in Indian constitution making. Not just within the hallowed halls of the Constituent Assembly, but also looking more broadly at women in the Indian independence movement and the influence of feminist thought and women's movements on the legal and constitutional imagination of a newly independent India. Through this conversation, we will touch upon the experiences of individual women in the independence movement and the Constituent Assembly, discussing the diversity in experiences of women there and recognizing certain overarching similarities. So with that, let's begin. And Priya, I thought it would be good for us to kick this off by discussing the role of women in the Indian national movement. Now, Indian feminism is generally thought of in waves, right? And the first wave of Indian feminism is structured around social reform. This is led by women like Savitribai Phule, by people like Rajaram Mohan Roy, who are arguing for widow reform or widow remarriage, for the abolition of sati, for women's education, etc. And then we come to the second wave of Indian feminism, which ties in with the Indian independence struggle, about like from the 1920s to 1947. So, Priya, can you talk to us a little bit about the history of women in the Indian national movement and women's organizations that led the Indian independence struggle?
Hi Shruti, happy to be here. This is one of my favorite subjects to talk about, as will be evident. Yeah, coming to your question, I think there were predominantly two women's movement that started almost parallelly. There was the WIA, which is the Women's Indian Association, which started in 1917, and the All India Women's Conference that started in 1927 and is still in existence right now. These were the major Indian women movement that were started. But the thing that sets this apart is that both of these were started predominantly by British Irish women, and they dominated, and that was also because they dominated the educated and middle class women, and there were Indian women who became a part of this organization and went on to lead this organization a little later during the nationalist movement. But like you mentioned, they started looking at social issues within India like Sati or Widow Remarriage Act or the Widow Remarriage movement or even the child marriage movement within India. And there were also the lesser social movements which included educating women, giving them sort of professional, vocational experience and trying to uplift women from lower class and show them how to stand on their own feet during the nationalist movement. And they were quite successful in that a lot of the reformation acts that they began ended up being part of the larger Constituent Assembly debates and subsequently a part of the Constitution itself. So I think they would be fair to call them quite successful. And the more importantly, they became a sort of breeding ground for women who were interested in participating in the national movement or in surfacing thoughts about how to bring about equal universal suffrage within India, how to get more women to lead political movements within India rather than just follow existing national leaders at that point in time. And I think almost all of the women who were in the Constituent Assembly were part of these movements, including Vijayalakshmi Pandit, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, Sarojini Naidu. They all were president of AIWC at some point or the other and went on to lead areas of the Constituent Assembly subsequently.
So there's two interesting threads in this, right? One is the idea of feminism where a woman is the subject of reform, right? And emancipation of women as a part of the feminist struggle. And the other, which becomes really prominent within the Indian independence struggle, is women as equal political participants, taking part in the political movement, negotiating with other leaders. I mean, one thing that really strikes me as like a very progressive part of the Indian feminism movement is during the Montag-Chelmsford Committee discussions and during the Southborough Commission discussions in 1918, there is a delegation of women who are demanding women's voting rights, right, and suffragette for women. At a time when England itself is going through a violent suffragette movement where women are not seen as equal political participants in Britain. And I mean, ultimately, the committee rules against women's voting rights in a very condescending and paternalistic way, saying that women are not there yet, right? And that Indian women are not mature enough, are not politically aware enough to participate in the process. But this question of political rights for women is something that is sort of both influenced by global suffragette movements, but also in some ways leads in thinking about women's rights and the suffragette movement in general. There are, like you mentioned, Annie Besant is someone who is at the forefront of this, right? She tries in 1925 to work with some liberal members of the British Parliament to pass what is called the Commonwealth of India Bill. And one of the key tenets of this bill is to remove discrimination on the basis of sex. This effort is unsuccessful, but I think what it shows us is that very early on in the Indian independence movement, women become equal political participants.
Actually, you brought up an interesting point earlier in this conversation, like how a lot of the social movements were rooted in this idea of feminism and the Indian feminist movement. One of the things that come across while reading about these women and their movements within the nationalist movement and outside as part of the larger suffragette movement is that they were very reluctant to call themselves as feminists or even position whatever they were doing as feminist movements for the fear that it would overshadow the larger nationalist movement and it would pit them against Gandhian nationalism or Nehruvian nationalism, however people would like to call it. The idea is that they tried their best to kind of fold it within the nationalist movement rather than set it apart. And one of their reluctance to use the word, see this as a feminist struggle, was that it would take away attention from the larger Indian independence movement. And it was quite interesting to see it that way because in hindsight, seeing it say 100 years later is quite obvious to us that these are feminist movements and we wouldn't hesitate to call them feminist movement. But I think there was always this duality that they were trying to establish, that these were nationalist causes, while at the same time these were also women's rights issues. And one doesn't necessarily negate the other, but at the same time, they also wanted to make sure that their voices were heard and their issues were paid attention to, even during times like, the Simon Commission movement, where the biggest issue was there were no Indian representatives in the commission. But at the same time, these were the people who were likely to give women the right to vote, given that British women already had the right to vote at this point. So these were the people who were likely to give Indian women the right to vote. So how do you make sure that the national idea of Indians being a part of the Simon Commission was being heard, while at the same time allowing the space to ensure that Indian women got the right to vote the next time votes happened. So that is an interesting point that you make. I mean, it's early on. I think that divide is one of the things that lasted throughout, and even through the Constituent Assembly debates itself. It was one of the things that came up again and again.
This struggle between multiple identities, right? Which is something that a lot of minorities in the Indian independence movement face. For example, scheduled castes, people who belong to the scheduled caste sort of struggling to get their rights and sort of talk about a historical oppression, while also recognizing that this is a really seminal moment where India as a whole is getting independence and not wanting to take away the sheen from that in a way, right? So the struggle that you speak about, Priya, is something that is struggle of multiple identities. The one thing, and I think this nicely leads us to our next theme, which is around women in the Constitution Assembly or in the constitution making process, is sexism in the Indian national movement, right? There's a lot written about how women are at the forefront of the civil disobedience movement, that women come in equal numbers to participate in the Indian freedom struggle. But at the same time, women aren't always treated as equal participants, and there are several women who sort of face typically sexist backlash for speaking their mind and for demanding their rights. One thing that, Priya, you and I have discussed before is Annie Mascarenhas, who is a member of the Constituent Assembly from Travancore, and a very upsetting letter that she receives from Mahatma Gandhi in 1946. Priya, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So one of the things that Annie Mascarenhas came upon, she gave this speech in Bombay. The thing is, we are not really sure what was the speech that was given, because it was covered by the newspapers at that time, but we couldn't figure out what the exact content of the speech was. But soon after the speech, Mahatma Gandhi, on February in 1946, Mahatma Gandhi wrote a letter to Annie Mascarenhas saying that, and I quote, "I know that you have no control over your tongue, and when you stand up to speak, you blab anything that comes to your mind." The speech is also quite a specimen, if the newspaper report is correct. I have sent the report to by Tanu Pillai. You can read it. "Such indiscreet talk can do neither good to you nor to the poor people of Travancore. Besides, by your act, you put the whole fair sex to shame." And this is a clear so much to unpack in this letter, because one, it's Mahatma Gandhi writing to a person, an advocate and a political worker who had enough to stand on her side. I mean, she was a really strong person who was going to give speeches about, like I said, there is no idea of what speech she gave, but to have received this sort of admonishment from Mahatma Gandhi and to have her reported to somebody else within her party saying that basically the message is, this woman has stepped out of her line, so please make sure that she is given some sort of punishment so that she doesn't do this again. And the letter was also basically, I think it went on to ask that she be removed from the party, or that be some sort of action taken against her for, regardless of the speech that she gave. This highlights the kind of reactions these women were getting from men within their own party and from men in the larger national movements. And this even extended to whether how they should get the vote, who should get the vote, and what kind of women deserve to get the vote. And there are, again, like you pointed out, there are multiple levels here, because on the one side, you have British women working for Indian suffrage, you have Indian women in Britain working for Indian women suffrage, and then you have Indian women working for the suffrage movement within India itself, again, which is also divided by class, not just by religion, by class too. So bypassing all these levels of social, educational and class levels, and then also the larger sexist conversations that were happening at that time. And we see quite a bit of it within the Constituent Assembly too, from leaders like H.V. Kamath or other men within the Assembly, K.T. Shah, and other men within the Assembly who repeatedly bring up the fact that these are women and there needs to be separate treatment within the constitution and in the way the debates were being conducted, because there were women in the assembly. And yeah, I think that leads us to like right next to the Constituent Assembly debates, where these women face quite a few challenges within the debate itself, although it is interesting to note that none of them were intellectual challenges, as in how would she know kind of challenges, but rather because she's a woman, therefore kind of challenges.
Before we move into the debates within the Constituent Assembly and certain comments and threads of arguments that appear there, I thought we could take a minute and talk about the women in the Constituent Assembly, right? Every year around Republic Day, there's always a post in a major newspaper about the 15 women in the Constituent Assembly. But these women aren't all the same. Right? There's some who come from incredible privilege, like Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, like Sarojini Naidu, whom we hear a lot about even in our school histories. And there are those who challenge the way that mainstream nationalism is thought of. Right? Someone like Leela Roy, who is incredibly radical, not just in her feminism, but also in the way that she thinks of the nationalist struggle. So, Priya, I thought it would be good for us to just touch upon a couple of women in the Constituent Assembly and sort of talking about the different threads of nationalism and feminist thought that these women represent.
So, like you mentioned, 15 women, and they came from very diverse backgrounds in one way, but also a lot of them had similar backgrounds in that they were privileged, they were educated, they represented a really small minority of women within India itself who had that level of education or had the privilege of having that kind of education. It has to be said, it was not easy for everyone. Like, for instance, Dakshayani Velayudan was one of the first women in her community to get educated and to rise to the position that she eventually held as one of the only Dalit women within the assembly. There were people like Begum Aizaz Rasool, who was a Muslim woman who had to cross quite a few barriers to get into the assembly, or even Durgabai Deshmukh, who ended up being one of the most powerful members in the assembly and in post-independent India. But I think apart from it, it's also interesting to note the various threads of feminism itself within these members, because there were women who understood that the talk about women's rights was not separate from talking about rights for all Indians, and they understood that this was not the place where you had to fight for women's rights. This was not the platform that to fight for women's rights as a separate issue, and this was the moment where all Indians had to come together to build a constitution and to come together to build a republic. But then there were women like Leela Roy who had really strong feminist backgrounds, as in she, as part of Subhash Chandra Bose's army, she pushed women to fight for independence. She made sure that women knew how to handle arms. She was part of the rejected ideas of women being mistress of the house, or women having to take a back seat while organizing nationalist movements. She was one of the first women to join an all-male revolutionary party, the Sri Sangha, in 1926, and she brought together Bengali women in a way that none of the other women managed to bring. And in 1931, she launched Jayashree Patrika, a magazine targeting women, and to bring together new nationalist sentiment that was built on the lines of Subhash Chandra Bose's idea of India. And there were quite a few varied strands of feminism, I think, within the assembly itself. There were people who thought that political movements on the ground mattered a lot more than people sitting within the hallowed halls of the assembly and debating what kind of rights men should have or women should have, what kind of laws should they be subjected to. People like Malati Chaudhary, who preferred working on the ground at Nawakali rather than sitting and debating how the union should be divided. It's not just like the men were painted with varied colors within the assembly, had their own sets of biases and prejudices which they brought to the assembly, and their learnings from the nationalist movement which they brought to the assembly. The women were also that different. I mean, it wouldn't be fair to paint all of these women with the same brush, saying that they were all interested in women's rights, they were all interested in talking about abolishing sati or the Widow Remarriage Act. They had different priorities coming into. Purnima Banerjee, for one, some of her strongest arguments were about incarceration and the rights for prisoners. And Hansa Mehta brought her as part of the one of the presidents of the UN Human Rights Commission. She was part of along with Eleanor Roosevelt, she wrote large portion of the UN Human Rights Manual. So I think that they brought different strengths to the table, and also at the same time, they were all different kinds of strengths. It was not the same kind of arguments everyone made.
I mean, both in terms of their political leanings, the issues that were close to their heart, their experiences, like you rightly mentioned, were incredibly different. And at the same time, there is this thread of some sort of disadvantage that they may have faced politically or personally because of their gender. Priya, you and I talked about Vijayalakshmi Pandit, who is amongst the most privileged women in the Constituent Assembly and the Indian independence movement, right? Sort of coming from the Nehru family. And yet, once her husband dies, she loses all her property because the laws at that time don't allow her to inherit. She wants to file a case against this, but Gandhi sort of advises her against it, right? And she sort of accepts that she and her daughters now have to live in close to poverty. I mean, in as much as someone like Vijayalakshmi Pandit can live in poverty, right? She's obviously incredibly privileged. But yet, even someone like her, whose brother is going to go on to become the first Prime Minister of India, doesn't have the ability to stand on equal footing with men when it comes to inheritance.
And it goes on to, I think, inform a lot of how Nehru also handled the Hindu the marriage act within the Hindu Bill of Rights at that point in time, the kind of debates he formed, I think. And a lot of this is also seen in the letters that Vijayalakshmi Pandit and Nehru shared at that point. The way he talks about it, the way you see his thoughts forming, you see his ideas taking shape even as he writes those letters, even as he sees the injustice that's being meted out to his sister because of the position that she has been put in just because her husband died, while without having a proper will return and without being able to give them any sort of remittance. A lot of the arguments within the debate are informed by the experiences that these women went through and how they impacted the men in their lives.
And one thing that I wanted to pick up on, which you mentioned earlier, Priya, which is, this idea that women in the Constituent Assembly still sort of feel almost diffident in expressing their ask for women's rights. Right? I quote Purnima Banerjee, who is so well spoken and really formidable in her own right. And she's making a very simple request that the seats that have been vacated by women should be given, the new members elected should be women, right? It's not a radical ask. And she says, "Sir, I'm conscious of a spirit of diffidence in moving this amendment, and I feel that in doing so, I may be opening myself to a certain amount of ridicule." Right? Already, like you can see this in all the sort of conversations where things like women's reservation or other requests around women's rights are made, women almost feel the need to preface it by saying, "Oh, look, I know this is not going to be received that well, but I still want to make this point." Or Hansa Mehta, when she's asking for social, economic, and political justice for women, starts out by saying, "I have the honor to have never asked for reserved seats, for quotas, or for separate electorates." So sort of defining or prefacing their ask by first saying, "Look, these are all the things I didn't do. I'd never asked for a women's reservation, but there are these other rights that I would like to ask for."
Exactly. And we see this across many of the women, what we would call an imposter syndrome, that they don't really belong there, or they got there by some fluke of luck and they're not sure how to handle it. Like one of the reasons Malati Chaudhary points out for her to step down from the Constituent Assembly debates is that sitting behind luminaries like Nehru or sitting behind luminary like Ambedkar and Aladi Iyer, she doesn't feel that it's her place to sit there and shape the republic when there are these men already there talking and who know the law, who know how to bring the country together. And she's better off doing what she knows better, which is working at the grassroots level with Gandhi. There are some instances of the contrary happening too. Like for instance, Durgabai Deshmukh was one of the strongest women amongst these 15 women. And this is an interesting part of the debates because Durgabai Deshmukh faces is that when she doesn't apologize for her position within the Constituent Assembly, or she's not differential in any of her speeches in the Constituent Assembly debates. And at one point when she nominates herself to present a bill, one of the blowbacks that she finds is that from one of the esteemed members in the assembly is that a lady presenting this bill is not suitable because the men might not push that hard or might not argue against whatever is being presented that hard because it's a lady that's presenting, and it wouldn't be right for the men. And she keeps insisting that she was the one who nominated herself, so they should just go ahead and argue whatever they wanted to argue. And it's interesting to see that dynamic being played out because at no point she makes excuses for her sex or she makes excuses for her position in the Constituent Assembly. But it's interesting to see the dynamic played from on one side where there are women like you pointed out, Purnima Banerjee and Hansa Mehta and all these people who kept saying, understand that this is probably not a place, or this is probably something that we are being given a great privilege of being here. And it's interesting to see this kind of dynamic between the women themselves because there were women who understood that this was an honor and they intended to make full use of it. And fascinating to read about their work and read about how they went about doing these kinds of things.
I mean, the one thing that really strikes me as I read the debates, right, is this phrase lady member, which is any argument that on any issue that a female member of the Constituent Assembly makes is like, oh, I agree with the lady member, or there is a good deal to be said in favor of what the lady members have said. Almost like sort of reducing their identity to their gender.
Yeah, exactly. And it was one of those things that has happened with respect to the American Constitution. Like at the end of it, she comes up and says, it would have, all this is well and good and I really love what we have done here, but it would have been nice if we had like a pocketbook size of the Constitution that, women and men could be carrying around so that it's a lot more memorable and it can be distributed a lot more easily. Why have such a big Constitution? And it's one of those things she's like extremely apologetic about it, but at the same time she brings up a really valid point. Would the Constitution have been better understood by the people of India, or would it have been a lot more digestible if it had been a shorter Constitution? No one knows. But that being said, there are pocketbooks versions of it now, but it's an interesting point she does bring up.
So one thing I wanted to talk about is an issue that did unite all the lady members, and I'm saying this in quotes, you can't see it, but I'm saying it in quotes, lady members united against, which was this idea of religious protection, right? So Article 25 of the Indian Constitution allows freedom of religious practice and protects certain religious customs. And a common fear amongst women is that now what we are going to protect are several customs that are practiced in the name of religion, let's say child marriage, polygamy, unequal laws of inheritance. And then invariably, one group that's going to be sort of disadvantaged by these customs, these traditions rooted in religion, is women. Right? They're not going to be able to realize their position as equal members of this new Indian nation. So when Article 25 was first presented in the Constitution, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur and Hansa Mehta, right to B.N. Rao, sort of saying, look, you need to have an exception to this. We can't, otherwise this is going to be used as a tool, as a freedom to take away women's rights. And they find an ally in Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, and of course they need a male ally, right? Who is part of the drafting committee and who says, I think we should take this seriously. And eventually we see the exceptions to Article 25 that are articulated. But this tension of individual rights of women versus religious rights is something that plays out in the Constituent Assembly, later in the Hindu Code Bill in the 1950s when Ambedkar and Nehru are trying to pass this. And even today, I would say, when we think about issues like the entry of women in Sabarimala, right? Whose right is it? Is it the individual woman's right? Or is it the community or religious right, which is obviously often framed by men?
It's also informed, I think, a lot by how they came to the Constituent Assembly, as in, this was something that started well before 1948 and around the 1930s when women were first given the right to vote, and sometime around the point when Lucknow Pact was signed, one of the things that they were discussing is separate Muslim electorates and question of female suffrage within this and how they would be representing India, and whether Indian women should be divided along those lines, along the lines of religion, was debate that happened. And at that point it was decided that it was not the most intelligent thing to do, because they wanted to represent Indian women as Indian women and not as Hindu women, the Hindu electorate and the Muslim electorate. And it kind of informs how these women see their role within the assembly too, as there is one single Indian identity over multiple religious identities. And this is something that keeps coming up again and again. Like you said, when talking about religious issues, there is this push by multiple members within the Constituent Assembly debates to establish one single Indian identity, and how it informs these debates, like the Uniform Civil Code or the Hindu Code Bill, and how protection of certain religious customs happens because of bills that are passed along religious lines. And we have to remember that these were women who had already created a revolution or created that sort of social movement well before the idea of an Indian Republic even was established, by having things like Sarda Act, by having movements that ensured birth control instructions for women, and education, primary, further education. And this was across all religions, and it was not again divided by religions, like, or even the Parda Bill movement that was taken up by the AIWC. And I think that this dichotomy of having an Indian identity or the Indian woman identity over every other identity is something that keeps happening again and again within the assembly debates. And of course, there are men who are on both sides too, like Manu Masnani or Ambedkar or even Alari Iyer. And that's why the Constituent Assembly deserves a good read, because to understand how some of these laws are shaped, or how some of these ideas of expressions, either women's expression or even religious expression, has been distilled down to the Indian consciousness because of the Constitution, is something that deserves to be read in full. There were thoughtful arguments that were being made by men and women as to why this is acceptable and not that is not acceptable. And we don't give this the kind of importance that we deserve. We don't give these debates the kind of thought that it deserves, and we don't reflect upon why that particular debate happened at that particular point in time and what was the history behind those debates. Like, one of the things that I keep telling, it's not just within the spectrum of religious, but at an overall level, for a lot of these women, the Constituent Assembly debates was the apex of their feminist movement that they had undertaken. And I'm putting feminist in brackets because of their ideas of feminism. But for them, it represented the end in a way, like from people fighting from 1915, 1917 for establishing the Indian female identity, for establishing universal suffrage rights, fighting at every point to remove social disabilities or laws that pushed women to the back burner, and then to see it all coming together within the Constituent Assembly, and to make sure that women are not divided by way of reservation, women are not divided by way of religious bills that are passed, or women are not divided by way of anything else, and all men and women are seen equally. There were debates of whether the word sex should be used in place of men and women, whether the idea of citizens should be used in place of men and women. And these were the kind of debates that ended up happening within the Constituent Assembly. And it was not because it was frivolous, because it was for them the final step before an Indian Republic became the equal platform that they all envisioned it to be. Unfortunately, it is not that now. I mean, we're kind of stuck back at like 1920s when they were talking about the other. But yeah, that's a different argument to be had, I guess.
I think that's a really important point that you make, right, Priya, to understand a lot of the fault lines that exist in the Indian public sphere today. It's not that different from the sort of debates and questions that were being discussed in the 1940s in the Constituent Assembly. The manner in which we discuss them might have changed, but in terms of the fault lines that exist exist, they are still the same, right? And I think each generation is sort of negotiating a new compromise around it, but thinks about multiple identities, about an Indian identity overarching other regional, gender, caste, religional identities is the same that we see in public life today. So just before we wrap up, I think the one theme that I do want to make sure we discuss is sexism in the Constituent Assembly, right? When we discuss or when we learn about the Constituent Assembly, whether it's in law school or in school, it's presented as this great defining moment of the Indian nation, that everyone who was there came together, cast aside their individual interests, produced a very progressive and liberal constitution. And in some parts, that's very true. But you do see the same sort of biases and prejudices, whether it's along religion, whether it's along gender, or whether it's along caste, that we see in public life today. So there are incredibly problematic comments made by members of the Constituent Assembly on gender. This one member, Loknath Mishra, when he's talking about why this is not an Indian constitution and it's more like a Western constitution, he says, given women equal rights, and he says if unfortunately, women claim freedom and equality in all respects and become competitors and rivals, then it'll be the end of our civilization, right? H.V. Kamath makes a comment that, if you allow women in public life, women are ruled by the heart and men are ruled by the head, then which way do you want your country to be run? So these themes or like these moments of sexism, which are pretty common in the way a lot of arguments on constitution framing are discussed.
I was not surprised when I read these comments. I was surprised that there were not more of them. And I guess in a way it was a relief that there were only these few instances of sexism. It sounds just bad that I'm both surprised and not surprised at the level of sexism that happened. But it's interesting because these were women who had achieved quite a lot and were at par with the men where education or social standing goes, and they were sitting there and making these arguments. And to have members like Kamath or others talk about them reduce their entire position within the assembly to their gender, like you previously mentioned, was disconcerting to say the least. But I think there is one bit of, I wouldn't say relief, but yes, one bit of relief was that for every sexist comment that was passed, there was significant pushback from other members within the assembly too. Like when Kamath made that comment about how comparing women to cows, that was really, really bad. Another male member of the assembly stood up and said, I don't know what you're afraid of. I don't know why you're so worried about being dominated by women suddenly. And it's interesting to see how these comments were made within the assembly, and it is it sounds very dismissive and sounds incredibly offensive, but it was also a bit of that there was pushback, but it was also slightly off-putting that the men had to come and rescue the women in a way.
I mean, the one exception I can sort of think of is Hansa Mehta calling out how this is not a joke, right? She says, this is not I don't understand what the joke in this is.
Or even Durgabai Deshmukh for that matter, when she says, I don't understand why you are so reluctant to argue against a lady when I put myself in this position so that you can argue. And, it is not my gender that you need to worry about. It is the argument that you need to worry about. So there was significant pushback from the women. But again, I'm looking at it, I'm putting this in the time that these debates were happening. That is the 1940s, the 1950s. And it is also reflective of the kind of men who were in the assembly, mostly educated, mostly elite, mostly well-traveled men who were in the assembly. And it was expected and also unexpected, to put it bluntly. And the interesting thing is how this sexism kind of carries, how this prejudices or biases against women kind of carries. So once the Republic is established and once the first round of elections are set to happen, there are these people going around and trying to figure out how to register all the women. So one of the barriers that they face is in the north. It's a very handmade Margaret Atwood kind of parallels here. But in the north, the women were registering themselves as wife of somebody or daughter of somebody. They were reluctant to give their names to the members who had come to register them for the election. And it was difficult because these men refused to put down their names as wife of or daughter of or sister of. And as a result, the number that I read was almost 2.8 million women lost their ability to vote in the election because they wouldn't register in their own name.
Wow. And I mean, that entire period of registering voters itself is a podcast we can do on our own.
Exactly. Even for that matter, when they came upon matrilineal societies, they were not sure how to handle women who had property rights of their own and not handed down by their men. And these were these little biases and prejudices that really tell us how Indian society was as opposed to how the Indian Constituent Assembly was, and where the bridge had to be crossed or where that gap had to be filled. Because all said and done, the Constituent Assembly debates were an environment in and of themselves.
I think with that, Priya, we're almost at time. Closing thought I want to leave with is, all said and done, the Indian Constituent Assembly was overwhelmingly male. Yes, there were 15 women, and that may have seemed revolutionary in some way, and universal adult franchise was given, and women were seen as equal political participants and equal citizens from the very beginning of the Indian nation. But 284 members in the assembly were men. A lot of the debates were framed by them. A lot of the most important members and defining members of the assembly were men, and we can sort of see that bias.
I mean, that's an important point, and I also think the reason why we need to read about these women or study about these women is not because of their role in the assembly itself, but rather everything that happened prior and post the assembly.
I think we're just about at time.
Thank you so much, Pawan, for the opportunity. Thank you so much, Shruti, for having me on this. And it's been wonderful to talk about this subject again. It's really close to my heart and I love talking about it at any given.
Priya, Shruti, thank you so much for joining us on BIC Talks and for this enlightening conversation. Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.